December 1944, Western Germany. Snow drifts silently over the skeletal remains of a once lively town near Aachen. The church steeple lies broken, its bell half buried in rubble. Inside a makeshift field hospital, a former schoolhouse converted into a ward, the air smells of disinfectant, blood, and wet wool. Under the weak glow of kerosene lamps, German nurses move like shadows. Their white aprons are no longer white. Every table is a stretcher. Every breath is a groan. The war has come to its breaking point, yet life still clings to its fragile edge. A young nurse named Helene, barely 23, presses gauze to a soldier's wound. But this one wears no German uniform. His jacket reads, U.S. Army. His face is pale, his pulse fading. She hesitates, just for a heartbeat, then keeps working. Outside, the distant rumble of tanks grows louder. Inside, the wounded American opens his eyes. Struggling to speak through pain, he whispers, barely audible. Thank you, Helene freezes. No propaganda, no order. No officer had prepared her for that word, and this was just the beginning. By the closing months of 1944, Germany's war machine was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. The Reich that once thundered across Europe now stood cornered. The Allies had broken through in France, the Soviets were pushing in from the east, and the Luftwaffe was little more than a shadow in the sky. But amid the smoke and ruin, one silent force still worked tirelessly: the German Red Cross nurses. They were not soldiers. They carried no rifles, held no ranks of command. Yet on every front, from the shattered ruins of Stalingrad to the forests of Belgium, they fought their own battle. The battle to keep men alive long enough to see another dawn. These nurses had been trained under a strict code: efficiency, obedience, endurance. When the war began in 1939, more than 90,000 women volunteered or were assigned to medical service under the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, the German Red Cross. They were taught to treat every wounded man without hesitation. Nationality was secondary to duty. But as the war dragged on, that principle became harder to uphold. By 1944, field hospitals were collapsing under the influx of casualties. Entire divisions were being wiped out in days. Supplies were vanishing, morphine diluted to stretch across dozens of patients. Bombings often destroyed hospitals faster than the wounded could be evacuated. And still, the nurses worked. They slept beside the dying, ate when they could, and memorized the faces of those they could not save. Many were teenagers, too young to vote, but old enough to carry stretchers through shell fire. As Allied forces advanced into Western Europe after Operation Overlord, the German Medical Corps faced a new crisis: the capture of their own hospitals. When towns fell, nurses were often trapped behind enemy lines. Some hid their uniforms, fearing retribution. Others stayed, continuing to care for both German and Allied wounded alike, knowing that any day, soldiers from the other side could burst through the door. The paradox was staggering. While propaganda on both sides dehumanized the enemy, these women were quietly sewing their skin back together. The Western Front, especially around Aachen, became a theater not only of steel and fire, but also of moral endurance. As the U.S. First Army pushed into Germany in the autumn of 1944, American soldiers began encountering these field hospitals. Inside, they found not hardened fanatics or propagandists, but exhausted nurses tending to anyone who still breathed. In many cases, the lines between friend and foe blurred entirely. German nurses would bandage captured Americans and place them beside their own wounded. Some even gave up their rations to keep them alive. For most, it was not politics. It was humanity. Yet, this humanity came at a cost. Nurses who helped the enemy risked being accused of treason by their own officers. Some were punished, others quietly ignored. The Third Reich's ideology had little room for compassion, especially toward those deemed enemies of the fatherland. But when faced with the moans of dying men, ideology often faded into irrelevance. Under the dim light of shattered hospitals, a silent form of resistance was taking shape, not through sabotage or rebellion, but through mercy. By the time winter descended in December 1944, the German medical network was stretched to breaking point. Hospitals lacked anesthetics, bandages were cut from old uniforms, and nurses performed surgeries guided only by instinct and courage. Many had not seen their families in years. They had long stopped believing in victory, only in survival. And survival now depended not on orders, but on the shared recognition that pain knows no nationality. As the guns rumbled closer to Aachen, a question lingered quietly in every ward. What happens when compassion outlasts conquest? The answer would come soon, carried on the boots of advancing American soldiers, through the doors of a German field hospital where mercy refused to die. The Allied push into Germany in late 1944 was unlike anything seen before on the Western Front. After the liberation of France and Belgium, the Allies stood at the doorstep of the Reich itself, but every mile eastward was bought in blood. The Siegfried Line, a vast chain of bunkers and fortifications stretching from Holland to Switzerland, slowed the Allied advance to a brutal crawl. Towns like Aachen, Hürtgen Forest, and later Bastogne became synonymous with misery. Mud, frostbite, and artillery fire turned every battlefield into a graveyard. The hospitals behind those lines, whether German or American, were overflowing with shattered bodies. Amid that devastation, a quiet intersection of humanity began to unfold. When U.S. and British troops breached the western borders of Germany, they often stumbled upon entire German field hospitals abandoned by retreating units. Inside were rows of stretchers, flickering lamps, and exhausted nurses who refused to leave their patients behind. Reports from the U.S. Army Medical Corps describe the same haunting scene again and again. Dozens of German nurses in worn uniforms, tending to both German and American wounded, often under the threat of artillery still falling nearby. In some cases, U.S. medics entered cautiously, expecting resistance or hostility, only to find the nurses continuing their work as if nothing had changed. The war outside had shifted hands, but inside those walls, the mission remained the same. One American officer later wrote, "They were calm, efficient, and utterly spent. We expected fear or hatred. Instead, we found discipline and compassion." The Geneva Convention of 1929 technically protected medical personnel, granting them neutrality. But in the chaos of total war, such rules were fragile. Frontline medics were often caught in crossfire or taken prisoner. Yet, on the Western Front, a certain respect for the healer's role still lingered among professional soldiers on both sides. American medics, many of whom had seen the same suffering among their own ranks, often chose not to disarm or detain German nurses immediately. Instead, they assisted them, shared morphine, or helped evacuate the wounded together. It was an extraordinary moment of shared morality, a glimpse of order amid an ocean of destruction. However, this mutual respect existed only in certain corners of the war. Elsewhere, especially on the Eastern Front, the story was far darker. German medical staff captured by Soviet forces were often treated as combatants. Many disappeared into prison camps, never to return. The contrast between the Western and Eastern fronts was staggering. In the West, compassion sometimes survived. In the East, vengeance consumed everything. For the nurses in the Western war zones, that distinction could mean life or death. Those near Aachen or the Ardennes still had a fragile hope that their medical neutrality might be respected if captured by the Americans. But those hopes were mixed with disbelief. For years, they had been told the enemy was monstrous. To imagine Americans thanking them seemed absurd. As the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, everything changed. The German counteroffensive swept across the Ardennes, isolating Allied units and creating chaos in both armies' rear lines. Medical facilities on both sides suddenly found themselves behind enemy lines overnight. In one sector, a German hospital staffed by Red Cross nurses treated both American and German wounded in the same ward. Because no one knew which side would control the area by morning. When the front shifted again days later, U.S. forces re-entered the town, expecting capture or sabotage. Instead, they found the nurses still tending to the same men they had fought against days before. It was here that the boundaries between victor and vanquished dissolved completely. War had stripped away politics, leaving only the raw duty to heal. The reports of such encounters began circulating through Allied command channels. Some officers were skeptical, others deeply moved. In a world torn by 6 years of hatred, the idea of compassion coming from the other side challenged everything they thought they knew about this enemy. By early 1945, as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine, field hospitals across Western Germany became strange islands of peace, places where uniforms mattered less than heartbeats. And as American medics and German nurses worked side by side to keep the wounded alive, the human story of this war began to change. The sound of gunfire faded outside, replaced by murmurs of gratitude inside. And soon, something remarkable would happen. The moment when American soldiers, standing amid the ruins of their enemy, would thank German nurses for saving their men. A moment that left those nurses in stunned silence. War is often remembered in numbers. Divisions lost, cities destroyed, lives counted by the thousands. But inside those broken hospitals of 1944, the war shrank to something painfully human. One heartbeat, one breath, one life that might still be saved. The German nurses who stayed behind in captured towns faced impossible choices. They were young women surrounded by the ruins of the Reich, cut off from their command, and watching their patients die faster than help could arrive. When the Americans entered Aachen, many of these nurses expected execution or imprisonment. Instead, they found themselves face to face with men who were just as weary, just as frightened, and just as desperate to preserve life. For a brief moment, the front line disappeared. A nurse's hand didn't distinguish between German or American flesh. A wound was a wound, and that was all that mattered. When U.S. medics began working alongside their former enemies, the atmosphere inside those wards changed. The smell of antiseptic and gunpowder lingered, but the hatred that had filled the air for years seemed to dissolve. One German nurse later recalled in an interview decades later, "We didn't think anymore about who was who. We just wanted to stop the bleeding." For the soldiers lying on those stretchers, mercy came not from a flag or uniform, but from the trembling hands of strangers who refused to give up their humanity. To understand what these women endured, one must see them as they were, soldiers without weapons. Their training under the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz was strict, almost militaristic. They were drilled in triage, sanitation, and battlefield evacuation. They could perform amputations under fire, deliver morphine in the dark, and silence panic with a whisper. But no amount of training prepared them for the winter of 1944. By then, most had not seen home in years. Rations were scarce and water often frozen solid. They slept sitting up between operations, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. When their hospitals ran out of bandages, they tore strips from their own clothing. When anesthetics were gone, they held patients down with their bare hands. Every night, the artillery in the distance reminded them that death was coming closer, not only for their patients, but for themselves. What kept them going wasn't ideology, it was discipline, and something even deeper. The quiet conviction that saving one life, even in a collapsing world, still mattered. For many, this conviction became their last link to sanity. Some nurses described moments when they forgot the war entirely. focusing only on the rhythm of breathing, the pulse under their fingertips. It was, in a way, their rebellion. While the Reich demanded destruction, they chose preservation. When American soldiers later thanked them, many could not comprehend it. Not because they didn't appreciate it, but because they had forgotten what gratitude even felt like. For months, perhaps years, no one had thanked them for anything. The war had taught them to expect nothing but loss. And suddenly, standing in the ruins, they were hearing thank you in the enemy's language. It was overwhelming and profoundly human. For the U.S. Army Medical Corps, the Western Front had already been a lesson in endurance. From Normandy to the Ardennes, medics had carried wounded men through minefields, freezing forests, and bombed-out towns. They had seen too much and learned to respect anyone who shared their burden, even if they wore the wrong uniform. When they encountered German nurses still tending to Allied prisoners of war, many were struck by their professionalism. Reports describe immaculate records kept under candlelight, precise dosages written in trembling handwriting, and even improvised operating tables made from doors and crates. One American medic, Private Robert Henley, wrote home about his experience in a captured German hospital near Stolberg. They had our boys lined up beside theirs. No difference. One nurse gave a Yank her own blanket. I didn't know whether to salute or just stare. Such moments defied every expectation. For months, the Allies had fought through relentless propaganda, portraying the Germans as unfeeling, fanatical, even monstrous. But here, under flickering lamplight, the enemy was saving their own. This realization reshaped how many Allied soldiers viewed the war. It didn't erase the crimes of the regime, nor the devastation Germany had inflicted on Europe. But it reminded them that within that machinery of hate, there were still individuals trying to hold on to decency. Among U.S. medics, respect for German nurses grew quietly but deeply. Some stayed after battles ended to help them rebuild makeshift wards. Others shared rations and medical supplies. A few even posed for photographs together. Rare, fragile images of peace in a time when peace still felt impossible. As the winter deepened and the front lines shifted again, these fleeting alliances would be tested. The guns would return, orders would separate allies from enemies once more. But something had already changed, something neither army could undo. In the shattered hospitals of Western Germany, compassion had survived the Reich, and soon that compassion would face its greatest test of all. When the war's most desperate battle, the Battle of the Bulge, would sweep over the region and turn those same wards into islands of humanity amid total chaos. Both sides understood, at least on paper, that medical personnel were non-combatants. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had enshrined their protection. Doctors, nurses, and stretcher-bearers were to be respected, even if captured. But the reality of a 6-year total war had blurred every boundary. For the Wehrmacht, medical neutrality was often ignored when survival demanded otherwise. Hospitals became command posts. Nurses were ordered to treat wounded soldiers in basements, while artillery batteries fired from the same rooftops. In many areas, medical flags were hidden to avoid drawing Allied bombers, even though the Red Cross symbol was supposed to protect them. By late 1944, this chaos had turned hospitals into part of the battlefield itself. Yet some German officers still tried to uphold the code. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, despite commanding defensive operations on the Western Front, issued strict orders that captured Allied medical personnel were not to be harmed. Similarly, many American commanders, particularly within the U.S. First Army, instructed their men to respect hospitals displaying the Red Cross, even if they were enemy facilities. This fragile code of honor held back the worst instincts of war. When American patrols entered towns near Aachen and saw nurses standing beside wounded men, many chose restraint over vengeance. The reason was simple. Medics recognized medics. It was a silent fraternity, forged not by allegiance, but by duty. In a time when the world demanded destruction, these small gestures of discipline from leadership allowed humanity to survive in fragments. Commanders on both sides understood that even a single act of compassion could carry moral weight far beyond the front line. And in the dying months of the Reich, those fragments of honor would become rare beacons, flickering lights in a nation consumed by darkness. No battlefield decision was more difficult than this. Should you risk your life to save a man who might tomorrow pick up a rifle and kill your comrades? For many German nurses, that question stopped being theoretical when American soldiers were carried into their wards. They recognized the insignia, the faces, the language of the enemy. And still, their instincts overruled ideology. They did what they had been trained to do: save whoever could be saved. Some nurses later admitted that the act of healing an enemy felt like both betrayal and liberation. Betrayal, because they knew their loyalty to the Reich was being questioned. Liberation, because for the first time in years they were acting freely, beyond propaganda, beyond politics. A nurse named Anneliese Weber, interviewed after the war, put it simply: when the uniform was removed, they all looked the same. I couldn't see enemies, only men who wanted to live. On the American side, medics experienced the same dilemma. When German prisoners filled their wards, they treated them with the same care given to their own wounded. Some soldiers resented it, others quietly admired it. Moral fatigue hung over both armies, a deep exhaustion not just of the body, but of conscience. By 1945, most soldiers were no longer fighting for ideology. They fought to end the horror, to make it stop. In that exhaustion, mercy became the last rebellion against madness. Every act of kindness, a blanket, a bandage, a whispered thank you, was a small stand against 6 years of hate. It did not erase the crimes of war, but it proved something essential. Even in humanity's darkest chapter, compassion still found a way to survive. When the guns quieted around Aachen and the Americans began consolidating captured hospitals, a strange stillness fell. For months, nurses had lived in terror. Now, for the first time, there was silence. But peace did not bring relief. It brought realization. The nurses who had saved American lives now stood face to face with those same soldiers, no longer as enemies, but as witnesses to something inexplicable. Many could not process what they had done. For years, propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless invaders. Yet those same men were now thanking them, offering them food, even protection. For some nurses, the gratitude was unbearable. They wept, not out of joy, but confusion. Their world had been built on obedience and fear, and now compassion was being rewarded by the very people they had been told to hate. U.S. medics, too, struggled with the paradox. They admired the courage of these German women, but could not reconcile it with the destruction their nation had caused. Some called it redemption. Others simply called it humanity in ruins. Psychologists studying wartime trauma later noted that these moments, when enemies shared acts of care, often left deeper emotional scars than the violence itself. Because compassion, in such settings, carried guilt. To show mercy was to remember that the enemy was human. And in war, remembering that was the hardest truth of all. By the dawn of 1945, when the snow began to melt and the Rhine lay open before the Allies, the hospitals of Western Germany had become silent monuments to this paradox. Many of the nurses who survived were later captured, interrogated, or repatriated. But among the Americans who had witnessed their work, a quiet respect endured. Some even carried those memories for decades, telling their families not of battles, but of the day a German nurse saved their life. And soon, those small, quiet acts of mercy would converge into a single, extraordinary moment, one that symbolized everything human that the war had tried to destroy. The moment when, American soldiers thanked German nurses in the ruins of a collapsing Reich, December 16, 1944. The Western Front, already frozen in exhaustion, erupted once more. In the early hours before dawn, a low rumble echoed through the Ardennes forest. Then, thunder, not from the sky, but from thousands of German guns firing in unison. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The last great German offensive of the war was underway, and it caught the Allies completely off guard. Within hours, communication lines were severed, units isolated, and panic spreading through snow-choked roads. American and German forces were once again locked in a chaotic struggle where front lines shifted by the hour. For the nurses and medics on both sides, the nightmare deepened beyond imagination. Hospitals that had been safely behind the front suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemy troops. Wounded men who had been saved now faced recapture or abandonment. The wounded were too many to count, and the air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and blood. In one such town near Eupen, a German field hospital operated inside an old monastery. Its halls echoed with the groans of over 200 soldiers, German, American, and Belgian civilians alike. The nurses, led by Oberin Anna Kruger, had not slept for days. They were running out of morphine, bandages, and food. Still, they refused to leave. When the front shifted again, the thunder of tanks approached from the west. U.S. forces, elements of the 99th Infantry Division, were retaking ground after fierce resistance. As they entered the ruined town, the monastery appeared intact amid the rubble. A Red Cross flag fluttered weakly in the cold wind. American soldiers approached cautiously, weapons ready. They expected snipers, perhaps an ambush. Instead, the doors opened slowly, and a nurse stepped into the snow, her white apron soaked with blood. Behind her, stretchers lined the halls, some carrying Americans, others Germans, all breathing the same air of agony and fatigue. The soldiers hesitated. Then a medic stepped forward. Inside, he saw what no one could have imagined. German nurses working side by side with captured American orderlies, treating whoever they could. Some of the American wounded had been in that hospital for days, taken prisoner during the chaos of the German advance. And yet they had not been mistreated. They had been fed, bandaged, and kept alive by the very people they had been told were their enemies. One American corporal later recalled, "They worked on us like we were their own. I thought it was a trick until I saw her crying over one of ours who didn't make it." The disbelief was mutual. The nurses had braced for arrest or execution. Instead, the U.S. officers ordered their men to lower their weapons. Then, something almost unthinkable happened. The Americans began helping. Together, they carried stretchers, changed dressings, and shared what little medicine remained. An American captain, Dr. Samuel Harris, was stunned at the precision of the German operation. Even under bombardment, the nurses had maintained order, rationed supplies, and documented every casualty. Their medical logs included American names, carefully written in German script, age, rank, and treatment. To Harris, this was not the enemy. It was professionalism under fire. He later wrote in his field report, "They honored the code better than some of our own men did in the panic. They treated suffering, not sides." By nightfall, the wounded were being evacuated to Allied lines. As trucks arrived, the Americans noticed something strange. Many German nurses stayed behind, refusing evacuation. When asked why, one replied simply, "We still have our men here." Even in defeat, their duty anchored them. The cooperation lasted only a few hours, but it burned into memory. In that monastery hospital, war momentarily ceased to exist. The silence between them, Americans and Germans, was not of mistrust, but of understanding. Outside, artillery flashes lit the horizon, casting shadows across the snow. Inside, bandages were tied, blood transfusions given, and prayers whispered in two languages, It was a fragile peace, born not from treaties or surrender, but from shared exhaustion. And when the first transport truck rolled out, carrying both Allied and Axis wounded together, the soldiers saluted the nurses who had saved them. No one ordered it. It just happened. When the last patient was loaded, Captain Harris turned to Anna Kruger and said quietly, "Thank you for keeping our boys alive." She didn't respond at first. Her lips trembled. Her eyes glistened behind soot and fatigue. For a long moment, she stood frozen, as though the words themselves didn't make sense. Because for years, she had been taught that Americans would show no mercy. And yet here they were, thanking her. That night, long after the trucks had gone and the town fell silent again, Anna wrote in her small notebook, "They came as conquerors, but spoke as men. I did not know we were allowed to be thanked. The war around them would rage for months yet, and the hospital would soon be caught between retreating German units and advancing Allied divisions. But something irreversible had already happened in those few hours. Something no military map could record. Mercy had crossed enemy lines. And in the days to come, as the last German offensive collapsed and the Allies advanced deeper into the heart of the Reich, that same compassion would echo again, this time on a scale no one expected. The Battle of the Bulge raged for weeks, devouring men and machinery in the frozen woods of Belgium and Western Germany. By early January 1945, the German offensive had failed. Tens of thousands lay dead or wounded, and the once proud Wehrmacht was bleeding out in the snow. The hospitals that still functioned were overflowing. Coal was gone, morphine gone, even soap had become a luxury. The German Red Cross nurses now worked in complete collapse, scavenging medical supplies from wrecked vehicles, sterilizing instruments with melted snow. They had long since stopped believing in orders from Berlin. Their world had shrunk to the radius of the next patient in need. Then came the retreat. Columns of wounded men streamed westward, pursued by the relentless advance of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. Entire towns surrendered without resistance, their hospitals included. But this time, something extraordinary awaited them. In dozens of captured medical stations across the Rhineland, American troops encountered the same sight. German nurses still at their posts, refusing to abandon their wounded even as Allied tanks rolled through the streets. In Simmerath, Roetgen, and Düren, witnesses described similar moments. Silence falling over the rubble as U.S. soldiers entered, the nurses standing at attention beside their stretchers, uncertain whether to salute, speak, or pray. And every time, the same unexpected thing happened. The Americans didn't fire. They didn't shout or threaten. Instead, the medics walked in, looked around at the chaos, and quietly began to help. In one hospital near Kesternich, the cooperation went beyond simple tolerance. When American officers saw the German nurses caring for captured Allied soldiers, they insisted on staying to assist. Together, they reorganized the ward, shared morphine from American stockpiles, and even established a joint triage line. The sound of English and German filled the air. Commands, reassurances, soft words to calm the dying. There were no translators. They spoke through gestures and instinct. A nurse named Elizabeth Voss, who later emigrated to Canada, recalled the moment vividly. They came in with helmets and rifles. We thought it was the end. But then one knelt beside a wounded boy and said, "Let me help." That was the first English I understood. For the Americans, it was equally jarring. Here were women they had been told were servants of a murderous regime. Yet their hands were steady, their care selfless, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. A medic from the 2nd Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "I saw a German nurse hold an American soldier's hand as he died. She kept whispering something I didn't understand. I don't think she knew who he was, only that he was scared." The gratitude came quietly, almost awkwardly. American officers thanked them in broken German. Some nurses smiled weakly. Others turned away, unable to process it. One even wept uncontrollably when handed an American chocolate bar. Not for the sweetness, but for the simple kindness behind it. Years of indoctrination had convinced these women that they were demons in the eyes of their enemies. But in those moments, they discovered that compassion had not vanished from the world. And for many Americans, that realization cut both ways. They had fought through Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest, seen atrocities and death beyond measure. And yet here, amid the rubble of the Reich, they were seeing the other Germany, the one that bandaged wounds instead of inflicting them. News of these encounters spread quietly through the ranks. Soldiers talked about the nurses who stayed. Some doubted the stories. Others swore by them. Army photographers captured a few rare images. Exhausted nurses in tattered uniforms standing beside American medics. Faces expressionless, eyes hollow but alive. These photos would later appear in post-war archives, barely noticed, overshadowed by images of victory parades and surrender ceremonies. But for those who had been there, they told a truer story. The survival of humanity in the middle of hell. By March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine, the war in the West was all but over. The German medical system had collapsed completely. American field hospitals now absorbed thousands of captured or surrendered German medical staff, doctors, orderlies, and nurses alike. Instead of punishment, most were reassigned to assist under Allied supervision. Many could not believe it. Instead of prison camps, they found themselves working in the same wards they had once feared being shot for entering. For the first time in years, they worked without fear, and often side by side with the very men who had once been their enemies. In one report from Remagen, an American colonel wrote, "They asked no questions, demanded no pay. They simply picked up where we were short of hands. They never complained. Some smiled when we thanked them, as if they had forgotten how." When the front finally passed and the guns fell silent, the memory of that gratitude lingered. To the German nurses, it was the strangest gift of all: acknowledgement. To the Americans, it was a reminder that even in war, decency could survive. The monastery hospital, the wards of Aachen, the makeshift clinics of the Ardennes, all became quiet symbols of a truth that could not be buried by propaganda or victory, that in the ruins of Germany, mercy had not died. The last lines of Anna Kruger's diary capture it best. They thanked us. No one in our country had done that in years. We were the defeated, but for a moment we felt human again. The war would soon end. But the echo of that thank you, whispered across blood-stained wards and bombed-out churches, would outlive the Reich itself. And in the coming months, as Germany collapsed and the Allies uncovered the full horror of what the regime had done, those quiet moments of compassion would stand as reminders that even among the guilty, there had been the merciful. May 1945. The guns of Europe finally fell silent. The Reich was gone. Berlin reduced to ashes, Hitler dead, and the once mighty German army shattered across the continent. But inside the ruins of its cities and hospitals, another story was beginning. One written not in orders or victories, but in the quiet hands of those who had kept men alive when the world was falling apart. The German nurses, who had worked through the chaos of late 1944 and early 1945, now found themselves facing an uncertain future. Many had been captured with their hospitals still intact. Others surrendered voluntarily, preferring to face the Americans or British rather than the approaching Soviet armies. They were neither soldiers nor civilians. Something in between, a gray zone of guilt and grace. For the Allied forces, the problem was immediate and practical. Millions of wounded Germans, soldiers, refugees, and civilians still required medical care. There were too few doctors, too little equipment, and too much destruction. And so, the same nurses who had served the Reich were ordered to continue serving, now under Allied command. In Aachen, one of the first major German cities captured intact, U.S. medical officers quickly realized they needed local expertise to manage the flood of casualties. They reopened parts of the Elizabeth Hospital and staffed it with a mix of American medics and former German Red Cross nurses. A strange partnership was born, enemy and victor working together, bound by necessity and compassion. Reports from the U.S. Army Medical Corps describe how these nurses worked tirelessly, often for weeks without proper food or rest, caring for both German POWs and American wounded who had not yet been evacuated. Language barriers led to awkward but humane moments, a nurse mishearing a command, an American medic teaching a few words of English, a shared cigarette during a midnight shift. Captain Robert H. Stone, a U.S. surgeon, wrote in a post-war report, "They were efficient, disciplined, and utterly exhausted. I found no hatred in them, only emptiness. When we thanked them, some cried. Others seemed not to understand what we meant. The nurses had been taught to expect arrest, interrogation, even execution. Instead, they were treated, in many cases, with a quiet, pragmatic respect. The Americans recognized skill when they saw it, and in those early months, it was skill, not ideology, that mattered most. But the shadow of guilt was unavoidable. Interrogators wanted to know whether they had treated SS officers or participated in the medical crimes that had stained Germany's conscience. Some were cleared quickly. Others spent months in limbo, awaiting denazification hearings. Many had been members of the NS Frauenschaft or the German Red Cross, both of which had been politically aligned with the Nazi state. Yet few of these young women had ever held power. They had obeyed, not commanded. Their records often showed the same pattern: years of nursing school, conscription into military service, and deployment to frontline hospitals under impossible conditions. In many Allied reports, the same phrase appears again and again: no evidence of ideological activity, carried out duties professionally. That professionalism, born in the ruins of war, became their lifeline. Some of these women went on to assist in displaced persons camps, treating Holocaust survivors, malnourished children, and refugees streaming in from the East. It was not redemption. Nothing could undo what had been done, but it was service. They worked quietly, without recognition, their white armbands now replaced by plain cloth, their symbols stripped away. One British officer later wrote, "They did not ask for thanks, but when they received it, you could see it broke something inside them." They had lived too long without kindness. The American soldiers who had once thanked them for saving lives never forgot those encounters either. Many later wrote about it in memoirs or letters, the shock of discovering humanity in those they had been trained to hate. A medic from the 99th Infantry Division described it best. "We had seen the worst of Germany. But that night, when she covered a dying man's face with a blanket and whispered a prayer, I realized not all of them were our enemies." As post-war Germany collapsed into hunger and ruin, these fragments of mercy remained. Nurses continued to work in Allied hospitals, in Red Cross shelters, and in makeshift wards set up among the rubble of Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Kassel. In many ways, they became the first quiet bridge between occupier and occupied. Living proof that compassion could outlast ideology. But the peace that followed brought its own reckoning. The same women who had once been thanked by American medics would soon face new accusations from their own countrymen. When the occupation deepened and denazification tribunals began, the same German nurses who had risked their lives for the wounded found themselves under suspicion. Many were summoned before Allied committees, forced to answer questions about their affiliations, oaths, and loyalties. Were you a member of the National Socialist Party? Did you ever refuse to treat a wounded man based on nationality? Did you assist any medical experiments? For most, the answers were simple but heavy. No, they had not joined by conviction. No, they had not refused care. No, they had not harmed anyone intentionally. They had simply done their duty, night after night, while the world around them burned, but even innocence came with a cost. The new post-war German state had little room for those tied to the old order, even indirectly. Nursing schools were disbanded, hospitals reorganized, symbols banned. Some nurses were barred from medical work for years, replaced by younger, untainted recruits. Others fled west, seeking new beginnings in American or British-controlled zones, where the need for trained medical workers outweighed political stigma. A few emigrated to Canada, the U.S., Australia, quietly, anonymously, never speaking of the war again. Yet their presence lingered in the memories of those they had helped. American veterans. Groups occasionally mentioned them in letters or reunions, the nameless German nurses who had stayed when others fled. There were no official decorations, no citations, no monuments, but in personal diaries and hospital logs, traces of gratitude remained. A small note found in the archives of the 12th U.S. Evacuation Hospital reads, "One German sister assisted throughout the night. She asked no questions, spoke little English. Before leaving, she thanked us for letting her stay." It was a quiet reversal of the moment, months earlier, when an American soldier, bleeding out, had thanked her for saving his life. That single word, "thank you," had traveled both ways across the lines of war, uniting enemies in the only language that survived the ruins. In post-war Germany, the nursing profession itself became a symbol of moral renewal. The Bundesverband der Schwesternschaften vom Deutschen Roten Kreuz, reformed under Allied supervision, emphasized humanitarian values, neutrality, and service beyond nationality. The generation of nurses who had lived through the war trained a new one, this time under the banner of peace. Some of those women later testified in documentaries and oral history projects during the 1970s and 1980s. Their voices were soft, often uncertain, but their memories vivid. I remember an American boy with shrapnel in his chest. I thought he would die. When he woke, he smiled and said, "Thank you." I didn't know what to say. I had never been thanked by anyone before. To historians, such moments reveal an overlooked truth. Not all acts of courage in World War II happened on battlefields. Some took place in silence, in wards filled with groans and flickering lamps, where compassion survived amid collapse. As Europe rebuilt, those wartime hospital wards faded into memory. Cities rose from ruins, nations rearmed, alliances shifted. But in the archives of both sides, in German Red Cross reports and American medical journals, fragments of that unlikely cooperation still remain. The documents describe a paradox: enemies healing each other in the final months of total war, not as symbols of peace, but as human beings confronted by suffering too great to ignore. One Allied report from March 1945 summarized it in a single sentence. They did what nurses always do. They treated the wounded, no matter whose flag they wore. By the 1950s, most of those German nurses had disappeared into ordinary life. They worked in clinics, raised families, or retired quietly, carrying memories that no one wanted to hear. The war had marked them too deeply for pride, but their small defiance, choosing mercy in a time of madness, became their hidden legacy. For the American medics who had met them, it remained one of the few bright memories in a dark chapter. Some kept letters or photos. Others spoke of it only once, decades later, when peace had dulled the anger. In the end, history did not remember their names, but the memory of what they did, of the moment when enemies became caregivers, endured in silence, passed from one grateful survivor to another, and it would echo again years later. When those same Americans met German doctors and nurses in NATO hospitals, now allies under a different flag. War had made them enemies. Humanity had made them equals. History often remembers who fired the last shot, not who gave the last breath. It celebrates the conquerors, not the caretakers. But in the ashes of 1945, amid the ruins of a dying Reich, a handful of nameless nurses proved that even in total war, mercy could survive. Their story is not one of glory or victory. It is one of endurance. They lived through a time when compassion was considered weakness, when ideology demanded hate, and when the wounded were measured not by need, but by uniform. And yet, they treated them all. Those small, quiet moments, a hand held, a wound cleaned, a whispered "thank you," carried more defiance than any weapon. Because to show humanity in a world built on cruelty was rebellion in its purest form. The war ended, the nations rebuilt, and the flags changed. But the memory of those hospitals, where American medics and German nurses worked side by side, surrounded by destruction, outlived the empires that caused it. They didn't heal nations, they healed people, and that, in the end, is what mattered most. Years later, when survivors spoke of those encounters, they never used grand words. They simply remembered the eyes of someone who should have been their enemy. Tired, hollow, but kind. A shared silence in which hatred had no language. That is the part of history that rarely makes it into textbooks. The moments when humanity refused to die. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the war's final winter. Not just who won or who surrendered, but who chose compassion when it cost them everything. The young nurse, Helene, the nameless medics, the wounded soldier who whispered, "Thank you." They all became fragments of a single truth.
Left side's deeper.
That even in the darkest chapters of mankind, the light we keep alive for others may be the only thing that saves us.